Hi, everybody. I'm so delighted to welcome you to this session today on the EU and gender parity and anti-discrimination legislation and thinking. But first, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Carolyn Dudek in political science, who's going to say a little bit about how the session came to be and what it's a part of, because it's part of a larger process here at the university. So Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you,
you.
Professor Charno. So I want to welcome all of you. So technically your course is part of, as Professor Charno alluded to, a larger project that's going on at Hofstra. And the title of that project is called Interrogating Hate, Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Racism in the European Union and at Home. This event today is actually sponsored by Hofstra's European Studies program. And more importantly, it is also sponsored by the European Union through the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet module grant. And our grant that Hofstra received from the European Union is focused on EU anti-discrimination and hate crime policy. And the idea of this grant is to infuse curriculum across several disciplines with European Union content around this issue area of anti-discrimination. So just to give you a little heads up, in spring 2023, as you all are registering for classes, there is a course that is cross-listed in Jewish studies, religion, and Latin American Caribbean studies. And the title of that course is Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Racisms, Global Perspectives, and that's going to be taught by Professor Slobodsky. So if this is something that interests you and you enjoy this session today, there'll be something similar going on in the spring. There's also some upcoming events in the spring, including 2 speakers that will be part of the broader Obama presidency conference that will be happening. And they'll be speaking about transatlantic relations during the Obama years. And we'll be also sending 2 teams to the SUNY Model EU, which will be taking place in New York. And hopefully we'll have some students from York University as well participating. So I really want to welcome Professor MacRae, and she's coming to us from sunny Canada. Look how sunny it is in her backdrop. Coming from Toronto, and she really is one of the foremost experts on the EU and gender. So it's an absolute delight to have you. I'm going to let Professor Charno formally introduce you, but before you speak, I have to just lay out one minor disclaimer that the European Union requests that we do. That this event is funded by the European Union. Views and opinions expressed are, however, those of the presenters only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or Hofstra University. Neither the European Union nor Hofstra can be held responsible for them. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Charno to give a much better introduction to our esteemed guest this morning. Sally?
Great, thank you. I'm gonna, my technological wizardry here. Oh no, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to add Heather and okay, here we go. So it is totally delightful to introduce Heather MacRae, who is an associate professor and the director of the graduate program in the Department of Politics at York University in Toronto. You know, one of the pleasures of the Zoom world is you get to meet people you probably would never have met in any other context. So here we are. Her primary area of research is gender policy in the European Union. And she has recently been working on questions, as you can tell from the work that you read, of how and why gender initiatives are often sidelined during times of crisis. Professor MacRae has been active in the European Studies community and as co-editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies and as the president of Canada's European Studies Association. She has co-edited several books and has published in a variety of journals, including the Journal of Common Market Studies, Social Politics, Western European Politics and Women's Studies International Forum. So just before I turn it over, because there's a lot of material here, Professor MacRae has said that if you have a question or if something's unclear, use the raise the hand function. And that way she'll know to be able to kind of pause and take questions during her talk. There will be time at the end for more questions regarding the presentation and the chapter. Those of you in our class read, some of you, thank you, sent us questions. And so Heather, I'll turn it over to you. Also, those of you in the Zoom room, it would be nice if you turned your cameras on, just because, you know, as we said the other day, looking at like black boxes with white writing is a little challenging when you're giving a talk. So if that's a possibility for you, please, please do. All right, thank you so much. And Heather, I turn it to you.
Great. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks very much for having me. Thank you for the lovely introduction. As Professor Charno mentioned, I am currently the graduate program director in our program here at York University. It's a pretty heavy and somewhat boring administrative role, so I don't get to teach as much as usual at the moment, like for the past year and a half. This semester, I haven't actually been allowed to be in the classroom at all, and I really miss it. So I appreciate this opportunity even more in light of the fact that I've kind of not been doing this too much lately. I hope that what I have to say will fit well with what you've been learning so far. Definitely, I'm all for keeping this relatively informal. So I know that this is a pretty broad kind of presentation. There's an awful lot of ground to cover. I'm glad you've read the chapter. And I'm trying not to just repeat what's in the chapter, but I also don't want to spend most of the time giving you a history of the institutions of the EU and things like that. So if there's something that doesn't seem to make sense, by all means, feel free to put your hand up and let me know, and we can backtrack and get whatever is missing clarified so that you understand what comes. And then maybe bigger questions we'll leave until the end. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. It's funny, we've been noticing lately, it's impossible to do this somehow without saying I'm sharing my screen now. There you go. Okay, hopefully you can see that. All right. So my area of interest, as we said, is in the EU's gender equality policies. And I think that just to sort of start off, if you go back about 20 years or so to the early 2000s, the EU was considered to be an international leader in gender equality policies. So over the previous 3 decades, so from the 1970s to about the early 2000s, the member states had agreed to some pretty far-reaching changes and goals in women's equality, in legislating women's equality. And a lot of these initiatives brought about fairly substantial changes at the national level. So for example, the UK, back when they were a member, didn't have any mandatory maternity leave. There was no, much like parts of the US, there was no law mandating maternity policies. All of the other member states did have some form of maternity leave. And so the EU passed legislation that would require states and employers to give everybody an independent minimum 3 months of maternity leave protected. And once that passed, the UK had to change their policies, and we had to have national legislation around that. So the EU, I guess what I'm trying to say, the EU can and does make a difference, and has made a difference in the national legislation, and this makes a difference in the lives of a lot of women and men. But over time, and particularly in the past 15 years or so, to me, but also a lot of other scholars have noticed that the EU's ability to bring about this fundamental change in the situation for women in the EU may have peaked. And currently, we may actually be seeing some backsliding or policies that are removing a lot of these gains. And I think it's important to look at why this may be happening and think about the context under which we might see the EU be able to reestablish that commitment to equality. And then in that sense, it also becomes an international leader and hopefully a model which other states can look to. So that's what I want to look at with you today. See, there we go. So we're going to start by looking at the state of equality in the EU, and I'm going to focus mostly on gender and women's rights, because this is a really broad topic. And although it is connected to a number of other forms of discrimination, and I will touch on them, one of the ways I'm going to try to narrow my talk a little bit is by focusing a bit more on the gender policies and some of those implications. So we're going to go back through history on a bit of a whirlwind tour, and we'll see how these policies came about and think about what steps contributed to the current state of affairs. And then we're going to look at some of the key challenges that the EU needs to face in order to actually bring about equality and be this sort of international leader that it potentially could be in this area. So let's start with what the EU claims to do and what it claims to be. And I know the words aren't too big here. It's always the problem with Zoom. Feel free to shrink me down to as small as you need me, get the presentation as big as possible. The European Union is founded on the value of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. And this is entrenched in the treaty. So the treaty for the EU, you have to think about very much like a constitution or sort of an overarching document. It sort of sets out the values of the institutions. So clearly, we can see equality, gender equality, racial equality kind of entrenched in this. A little bit later in the treaty, it says that the European Union shall combat social exclusion and discrimination, shall promote social justice and protection, equality between women and men, solidarity between generations, and protection of the rights of the child. So again, in other words, this statement of values stresses that they aren't just looking at equality between men and women, but really at a much diverser number of discriminations or possible discriminations, diversity, social inclusion, participation of all individuals in a fair, just, and equal society. But on average, women earn 14% less than men. 35% of Muslim women living in the EU report something as simple as their choice of dress leads to discrimination when they look for employment. 42% of the Roma households in the EU have no access to water, sewage, or electricity. 55% of Black Europeans have a household income below the threshold considered to be at the risk of poverty. 2/3 of the LGBT community in the EU said that they avoid holding hands in public with a same-sex partner for fear of being assaulted, threatened, or harassed for doing so. So clearly, equality in practice looks a lot different than equality on paper. And what's happened at the legislation level is not filtering down to the realities of individuals in the member states. I'm going to speak about the EU typically as a single entity, and I think it's really important to put it out here right now that it's not. The EU, as you know, is made up of 27 different member states. So, it may well be that in some states, same-sex partners could walk down the main street and nobody would say anything. Whereas in other communities or other states, there may be very different policies or very different responses. So even though I'm putting out the EU as a single entity, there are absolutely differences between those states, even more than you would see between the states in the US or in Canada. So why doesn't the EU live up to its goals then? Why can't it realize this challenge of equality? Where do women's rights and gender rights fit into the story? And I'm going to kind of look at 3 overarching reasons that the EU can't reach its goals. The first is sort of an institutional explanation. The second is a little bit more historical, path dependency, where does it come from? And the third is more about the political context. In terms of institutional barriers, this is where I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it would require too much time and too much background explanation about the EU. But what I think it's important to remember and to know for context is that the EU is not a state. It doesn't act like a federal government. It has some characteristics and some tendencies which allow it to set frameworks like a national or a federal government would, but every member state is still independent, even more independent than individual states in the United States of America. So each individual country still retains substantial amount of control over policies. And this is particularly true for issues like equality, which are considered to fall under the rubric of social policy. So anything that's considered to be about social policy still sits largely in the jurisdiction of the member states. Well, then what does the EU do about any of this? And why do we talk about the EU as having, gender policy? because the EU has this really important power, which is to bring the states together to negotiate, to find common ground, and in doing that, to bring about some form of cooperation and sort of collective action. So when there is agreement and possibly even EU level legislation, it still has to be put into practice by the individual states. And those countries or governments get to do it however they see it best fitting with their own traditions and their existing laws. So the EU sets minimum standards, and as long as you meet those minimum standards, you're okay. You can exceed the minimum standards. You can have little clauses in it that might actually in practice limit the minimum standards. But as long as you meet the basic requirements set by that overarching legislation, you're okay. So for example, just last month, the EU passed legislation requiring companies to have women to take up at least 40% of non-executive board seats or 33% of all board director roles in major corporations by 2026. Okay. Now, some member states had already done that. And so at the moment, women's representation on corporate boards varies really widely across the EU. So there's a low in Cyprus with somewhere under 10%, something like 8.5% of the women on corporate boards, or of the people on corporate boards are women. And in France, it's over 45%. If a state doesn't have a law in the books right now about quotas on boards, then this new legislation will require them to pass that. And past practice from other member states, which you can see here on this slide, shows that once you implement this quota rule, it is likely to make a difference. So Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands already implemented this quota rule back in 2011. And you can see that once it was announced, there's a very marked upswing in the number of women that are on corporate boards. So it's likely that once the EU passes this, we will see changes across the board. But notice that just because these states have passed basically the same standard legislation, the outcome is still very different. So the Netherlands still has about 30%, whereas France has 45% of the board being women. So even though they have the same laws, the outcome differs. Now, what the EU can do is require this law to be in place. But the actual content of the law is up to the state legislatures, to the country legislatures. So some of them might set the bar at the bare minimum of 33%. Others might say, hey, if we're going to do this, let's go for 35%. Let's aim for 40%. Hey, let's aim for 50%. Some of them might say, some states might say, you get fined if you breach this legislation. Others might say, you'll be warned, or you might be, I don't know, sanctioned in some way that really doesn't have a lot of impact. Some states might choose to not only require gender representation, but also racial or ethnic representation on boards. Others might focus only on gender because that was the minimum requirement by the EU. So in the end, you can imagine that even though we have this EU legislation in place, or we slowly are going to have it in place, there's going to be variation across the states. And those will be exacerbated by the cultural, the social, the political, the historical differences between those states. The EU sets the bar, the member states get to deal with the details. Here's another example. This is the gender pay gap across EU states. And I think this is a really interesting place to really start, because it is the very first issue that the European institutions tried to tackle under the rubric of women's rights. So 1957 was the first legislation at the European level around equal pay. So 57, we're looking at close to 70 years at this point. And you can see that not only are we very far away from equal pay, and again, I know this is really small, so I'll point out a couple of the ones that are kind of key. The EU average is 13% pay difference. So that means that on average, women are earning 13% less than men. Or worded differently, we could say that they're earning 87 cents for every dollar that men are earning in the same position. But you can still see that there's a really big difference across the states, and they don't necessarily make sense as to why. It's not that Western states have less of a pay gap and Eastern states a bigger pay gap, because here you'll see Romania and Slovenia are right near the top at almost equal pay. So Romania has 2.4%. See if I can make this slightly bigger. I don't know if I can, if that'll, That make it ever so slightly bigger for you? So you'll see Romania, Slovenia are at the very top. Poland is near the top. And at the bottom, third from the bottom is Austria. So why, we can't say it's just east-west. We can't say it has to do with size, because again, some very small states, Cyprus is definitely in the top part. Malta is near the top, but there's also some smaller states down at the bottom. Germany, which people would expect to be near the top, or might expect, 18%. Denmark, the Netherlands, hey, we always put these states up as being like really central and aware of women's rights. They're still falling in below the EU average. So what is it then that's causing this? To put it into context, compared to the US, there's approximately a 17% wage gap between men's and women's earnings at the federal level. And this also has a huge variation in the US. The stats I was looking at said it was 36% in Wyoming, 9% in Vermont, with New York State coming in around 15% near the top. So you have a similar variation, maybe even larger in the US. Again, the only reason or the only explanation that we can give here comes down to the ways in which the member states are implementing and enforcing the rules. So the EU sets the rules. The member states have to patrol it, make changes to their policies in a way that will actually bring about change. Another institutional barrier I think that we need to at least be aware of then is this question of enforcement. And I don't want to get bogged down, like I said, in how the EU works, but let's say for now that it is incredibly complicated for somebody who is discriminated against to have their European rights enforced. There is a Court of Justice of the European Union, but it's not easy to get to. It's not so much a financial barrier, but more of an institutional set of barriers that prevent people from just being able to take the state or the EU or the corporation to court. And the EU really doesn't have the mechanisms in place to ensure compliance. So this is one of the big reasons that the EU has these great ideas, but it doesn't pan out on the ground. There's also a historical legacy. And I mentioned that equal pay was the very first real legislation that the EU started looking at. And there's a good reason for that. There's actually, I think, there's a number of interesting stories around the equal pay legislation that I don't have time to tell you all of them, but while the EU has very limited powers in some areas like social policy, they have fairly deep and extensive policies in other areas. So the labor market regulation is actually fairly well developed in the EU, and that means that the EU can actually pass laws that can be or must be immediately implemented at the national level, even if states don't change their laws. And other policies like trade policies, the states aren't actually even allowed to make laws about. All of that falls to the EU. So there's different layers of EU legislation. What that means for gender rights and non-discrimination is that they try to frame anything to do with equality that might be easily achieved at the EU level or more easily achieved at the European level than at the national level. They try to frame it in a way that gives the EU the rights and the responsibilities and the jurisdiction over it. So it means that often these things are then shaped around equal pay or economic questions, okay? So going back, as I said, 1957, we implemented Article 119. Now, Article 119 in the Treaty of Rome established this principle of equal pay for men and women. And it sounded pretty radical at the time. I mean, 1957, equal pay for men and women was already pretty, on the ball. And it's even more interesting when you think about the fact that it was all men who were negotiating this. But the founding fathers did not have any real intention of advancing women's rights in the treaty. That was not their interest at all. They wanted the treaty to look good. So Article 119 was an economic principle. And it was insisted on by France in particular, because France had already passed an international labor organization, an ILO legislation requiring equal pay. And France was the only one of these original 6 member states who had passed that law. So France was required, now they weren't actually doing it, but they were required to ensure legislation for men and women getting equal pay. In contrast, Germany had women working for 60% of men's pay. So it was cheaper for labor, for cheap female labor in Germany than it was for female labor in France, which meant that the French were worried that they would be undercut by this cheap German labor. And they wanted to prevent that from happening, because once these policies were all in place, it would be very easy for companies to pick up and move to the places where there would be cheaper labor, which is something we hear about even today, right? You worry about jobs going to Mexico, jobs going to wherever, China, etc. So the main goal for this equal pay was around a level playing field between the member states for competition. But when they looked at their draft just before it was signed, they realized there was practically nothing under social policy, which was the section right below competition. And the framer said, hey, you know what? This is about equal pay. That's kind of about women. That's kind of social policy. Why don't we just take this article and drop it down into the social policy section? And so that's what they did. But they didn't reword it. So what ended up happening was that you had this incredibly strongly worded commitment, what you would expect to see for competition policy, dropped into social policy where things are typically very wishy-washy. And so all of a sudden we had this real intense commitment for equal pay for work at the moment, it was still for equal pay for equal work, but that soon changes. And it comes about right about at the time when women's rights activists were starting to push for these sorts of things like equal pay and access to unions and things like that. And so this picture here is a number of Belgian women who actually, when they were on strike for equal pay, actually called upon their government to implement Article 119. So this is the first time then that people actually were reaching into these European treaties and saying, hey, we have a European right to equal pay. So activists use this article at the very beginning for pretty radical means, and it moves through the courts and it expands rights, not just in the area of equal pay, but eventually it expands the concept of pay and the number of things that are considered pay. There's some really interesting court cases around an airline called Sabena, which forced female flight attendants to retire at a much younger age than men had to retire. And in the court case, one of their reasonings was that it was actually very reasonable for the businessmen, because they were only men traveling by airlines at that point, for the businessmen to expect their drinks to be served by a pretty young thing. That phrase is actually in the court documents, a pretty young thing, referring to the flight attendant. And that's why it was okay to ask her to retire at 40, but we'd let the men work until 45 or 50. So all of these things slowly come about as part of the EU legislations. Long story somewhat shorter, we see a scope of this policy now gradually expanding from employment and pay to access to the labor market, to reconciliation policies, which focus on men and women and fair access to things like parental leave and as well as employment opportunities for women. And then eventually a move to what we call mainstreaming, which is supposed to check out all policy for impacts on men and women. But that's only one part of the history of rights in the EU. So it gets into more and more areas. But at the same time, the EU is starting to bring in other forms of discrimination. So this starts really around measures to combat anti-Semitism, and then later anti-Black racism. And this happens particularly in the 1980s when we see a real rise in right-wing civil society action, both civil society and protests and things, and in the governments as well. And so you can kind of think about the EU's non-discrimination legislation along these two axes. On the one hand, we've got this women's rights axis, which is slowly bringing women's rights into more and more areas. And at the same time, we've got an extension from just women and sex-based discrimination to race, ethnicity, age, ability, sexuality, and all sorts of other forms. So now we're at a point where there is a pretty significant body of legislation around non-discrimination. But these are almost all still grounded in these original economic and neoliberal principles of the original institutions. Remember, because that's the easiest way to get the EU to take something on board without backlash from the member states, is to say, oh, it's all about economics. But it becomes a catch-22. So a lot of feminists and other activists complain that even when the EU tries to go beyond the economic focus, this logic is still there. So if they do a directive on equal treatment in goods and services, which tried to introduce equality outside of the employment sphere, and look at things like equalizing life insurance premiums for men and women, and haircuts should have been based on length and not men's haircuts price versus women's haircut prices. The only things that ended up staying in that legislation were the things that could be clearly and closely linked to economics. So feminists have learned that if they want to pursue something at the EU level to advance the rights of women, they should formulate it around economics. But that means that all we're doing, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're complaining on the one hand that the EU only sees women when they're economically active, and it doesn't notice unpaid labor and things like that. And yet the only way to access women's rights at the European level is to frame it in this economic sphere. So that's what the activists are doing. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that we have to be careful about what we're seeing, and I'll get to this afterwards, around other forms of discrimination as well, like racism and xenophobia, anti-Semitism. I think that there is a similar tendency to be trying to frame these things in a way that lets them fit into the bigger economic sphere. So we have to be careful, according to the EU, not to discriminate against migrants. They need access to the employment sphere in order to ensure that they can be active citizens. So this connection between employment and labor and economics and your role as a citizen is really, really strong in all of the European non-discrimination kinds of policies. So the EU's got this pretty extensive array of legislation that they're trying to treat men and women equally, but also another set of non-discrimination policies around ensuring no racial or ethnic discrimination in access to education, the workplace, based on age, orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, all these sorts of things. But there's still, like I said at the beginning, this huge amount of inequality or inequity. And in addition to this historical legacy and the institutional barriers, there's also big political challenges that are preventing the advancement. The larger context, starting in 2010, the EU has been in a state of perpetual crisis. So first there was the economic and financial crisis, and that hit some states harder than others. Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Italy were particularly hard hit, although in different ways, but it was very costly. And one of the things that led to was initially a recession starting around 2010. And this recession hit the manufacturing sectors and the financial sectors the hardest initially. And so there was actually a lot of conversation around the so-called he-cession. It wasn't a recession, it was a male-dominated he-cession. So the states invested in these businesses and these sectors in order to ensure that manufacturing and financial sectors got back on their feet. But that meant that they had to find the money to do that somewhere. And that meant austerity measures. So the state had to cut back the spending that they had made in other areas. So they cut the bureaucracy, typically money going to teachers, hospitals, support workers, various other early childhood educators, things like that. And they cut back state services like welfare and programs that may have been to bring lunches to kids in schools or things like that. That all gets cut back. So we save the male-dominated sectors and we cut back in the female-dominated sectors or in the places where it hits women the most. And a lot of people realized this and started talking about the importance of gender in the recovery process. But it was generally ignored. And just as we were starting to recover, the migrant and refugee crisis came along. And that put a new burden on the states. And again, a lot of those states in the hurry to just address this million people coming into the states, they didn't really think about gender. Then came Brexit. There's a whole literature on how Brexit and the removal of the UK from the EU was gendered. And then comes COVID. And that's another incredibly gendered and racialized crisis. So frontline workers and the most vulnerable tend to be women or racialized workers. The only state that collects data based on race and ethnicity in the EU used to be the UK. And they showed that typically immigrant, or we'll say non-white British, were much harder hit by the COVID crisis than white British, even controlling for everything else like income, education, etc. The immigrant or long-time immigrant population from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka were incredibly hard hit. Black populations in the UK were very hard hit and had much poorer outcomes of recovery. So even here, they're saying we have to start to look at gender as part of these things. But if you look at the charts, on the left, you see the sectors that were hardest hit by the COVID crisis. The red lines are the number of women that were in those sectors. The green lines are the number of men in those sectors. So you can see that in education, health and social work, accommodation and food services, arts, culture, and recreation, it's generally female dominated, and they were hard hit by the crisis. Where are we putting money in the EU for recovery? Into construction, agriculture, energy, transport, information, and communication. The green lines represent the male domination in these sectors. The red lines represent female domination. So it's pretty clear that even though all sorts of people in all sorts of institutions are saying you need to take gender into consideration in the recovery project, it's not happening. Why? Well, the EU has this new process now that they're calling Next Generation EU, which is a multi-billion euro recovery plan, 750 billion euros, that are supposed to bring the EU's key priorities into the recovery process. And there's a bunch of different funds that do this for slightly different kinds of progress, but the overarching theme is supposed to be digital economy, equity, and climate change. But the EU only asks the states to suggest projects and show how they'll make these things fit. So you suggest a project, you get the money from the EU to do this project, and you say that it will be gendered in this and this way. But the EU has no way to follow up. They have no way to make sure that it's actually happening. So the EU again is setting its priorities, but the member states aren't forced to implement it. And if they do, then it's only in a way that doesn't actually fundamentally change or give up control. Which brings us to the next big challenge, which is more and more governments in the EU are shifting to the right. And with this comes at least two phenomena. States like Hungary. Okay, I don't know how much you've heard about Hungary in class or elsewhere. Viktor Orban's government has declared themselves to be an illiberal democracy. And what that actually means is that the state is openly rejecting pluralist beliefs like equity based on gender, minority rights, things like that. They have actually, in some parts of both Poland and Hungary, declared geographic areas, specific cities or regions, to be LGBTQ-free zones. You're not allowed to be gay or homosexual or trans or queer or anything else in these spaces. The EU countered by passing legislation in the parliament that all of the EU is an LGBTQ friendly zone. So clearly there's a conflict. And this is how states, especially these right-wing states, are sort of grandstanding and positioning themselves as stronger than the EU in order to gain national support. And this is something that is typically happening in the right-wing states. And we are seeing an increased number in them. So the second problem, though, as we see more and more governments that are right-wing, is that the EU institutions are made up, at least in some of the institutions, of representatives of these national governments, which means that as the governments shift to the right, there are fewer people at the EU tables who are openly supporting liberal ideas like gender equality. So not only are the initiatives that may pass eventually blocked at the national level for implementation, but fewer and fewer initiatives are likely to be adopted as we see fewer and fewer left-wing or even centrist governments and more right-wing governments. So now what? For me, the final challenge for the EU is actually both a challenge and a solution. Typically, the EU and the member states consider gender as one form of inequality, and they consider religion or ethnicity to be another form of inequality. And this creates a series of little silos where they try and fit differences into neat little boxes. But so often discrimination is not the result of one factor. Barriers exist because of complex identities. So in the past, if a woman was discriminated against in her employment because she wore a hijab, she would have to prove discrimination based on either religion or sex. Well, we can't say that she was discriminated against because she's a woman, because there are lots of other women working in that same employment who are not being discriminated against. Now, they're not being discriminated against because they're not wearing a hijab, but that's beside the point. She cannot claim it's based on sex. She also can't claim it's based on her religion, Muslim, because there are lots of other Muslim individuals who may be male who are working in that same institution who are not facing that discrimination. So something that is unique to Muslim women gets lost because we can't, or the EU was not typically looking at intersectionality, but requiring all forms of discrimination to fit into one box or the other. So slowly now the EU is starting to think about discrimination in a way that doesn't perpetuate binaries. And it doesn't rely on these simple distinctions like male and female. And this needs to be a very conscious move to implement intersectional policy measures. And it's really easy to do on paper. And I got all sorts of policy studies showing that they can do it. But it's really difficult to do it in a meaningful way on the ground because it means rethinking some of these long-held beliefs and practices for both institutions and activists. And I think one of the main challenges now then will be to implement those measures, which means encouraging member states to take concrete steps to entrench equality, not just for men and women, but across this range of differences: religion, ethnicity, race, ability, age, sexuality, gender, etc. I think there's still a huge lot that could be said, but for now, I hope this is sufficient. So I'll end here and maybe turn the floor over to you for thoughts, responses, questions, clarifications, and anything else. And I will stop sharing. Oh, I think you're muted, Sally.
Yeah.
I said, thank you so much. So many thoughts and reactions. We have a number of questions from students that who sent me questions. So I'm going to start with those, but
Okay.
others of you, please put your questions in the chat for Heather so that she can see them and hopefully we can get to as many questions as possible. Of course, we'd like to keep you all day, but we can't. So to begin, and this may be sort of outside your purview, but because we're here in the United States, there were a number of questions that came in asking about sort of anti-discrimination policies in the EU. And also, I mean, I would say in Canada, because you mentioned that in your chapter, relative to policies here in the United States, and how might you compare and contrast these things for us as Americans?
I mean, I think one of the biggest differences between Europe and the US or Canada, and I think there are even differences there between the US and Canada, but I think the biggest difference is that both Canada and the US have always had visible minorities. There's, I mean, always, yes, we can go back to the indigenous populations, right? So I think that you've always had multiracial and multi-ethnic communities. And in the EU, this has been much less the case. So race and ethnicity haven't been at the center of the EU's policy making until much, much later. And that's a result of largely immigration that happens much later. So starting in the 1960s and 70s, some of the states saw guest workers, particularly from Southern Europe, from Turkey. But really, you know, huge waves of immigration bringing people from the former colonies like Algeria and Tunisia into France, Suriname into the Netherlands. This doesn't happen until a lot later. So the EU hasn't really focused on that. And you can't make it economic, at least not right off the bat. So the EU always said it's not our job. Whatever you do to integrate these new populations, that's your job, states. You figure it out. And the problem was, once they implemented, and this is something I couldn't go into my talk, the EU now has this rule around free movement. So once you are a citizen or a resident of one EU state, you have the right to move and work in any other member state. And this is a way that a lot of minority rights activists are starting to push for better recognition of other inequalities, because they say that their ability to travel, for example, as a Black French person to hypothetically Croatia is limited, because in Croatia, they won't be able to get a job because they will be discriminated against. But the EU rights of free movement say they should be able to move. So they're using this as a way to slowly start to expand. And that's never had to be a conversation in the US or Canada, because of course, we've always had free movement between the provinces or between the states. You can work in Florida and live in Arizona, whatever, you can move around between those states as you want. Once you're a citizen of the US, you're a citizen of the US. So I think that that's been very different. I think too, the systemic inequalities are different. The ways that the institutional structures were built up in the EU have always favored the state over citizens, which means that you don't see the same kind of institutional barriers to somebody because of their skin color or their religion in accessing the institutions. Whereas in the US or Canada, a lot of the institutions are themselves designed precisely to prevent certain groups from gaining access or power to certain institutions. And that didn't happen in the same way in the EU. So I think that there are ways in which the discriminations come to light are different, which has led to different ways of dealing with it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because in France, a country that wants to tell itself that it's French, of course, had huge waves of immigration in the late 19th century, and in many ways refused to recognize those immigrants as such, right? And still didn't see itself as a multi-national or multi-ethnic society, and it's being pushed to see itself that way, probably mostly through soccer. But anyway, yeah, it's such an interesting comparison because we're such different entities. We have, just to pivot for a minute, we have one student who comes from a Polish background. And she's asking, she says, since July 2021, do you think there has been any real progress in the EU's effort to prioritize LGBTQ rights in Poland and Hungary? And if so, what has changed?
So one of the things that the EU is trying to do, I said a number of times in the talk that they don't have any teeth, they can't enforce legislation. They're trying to solve that. And if you remember at the very beginning, one of my shots talked about sort of the values of the EU. One of the values of the EU is the rule of law. And so, and they say specifically in that treaty that these are the values of the European Union and the member states. So what they're using now against particularly Poland and Hungary, but also a number of other states who are starting to limit some of these rights, is to say that these foundational values are required to be a value of the state in order for them to be a member of the EU. The problem is there's no real way to kick somebody out of the European Union. So because Poland, Hungary, Croatia, a few other states are not living up to those rules, and they are not recognizing the rule of law and liberal values, they can't be kicked out. But the EU has kind of made use of some little possibilities to link finances and funding to the rule of law. And so this has been challenged in the courts, and for the most part, it is being upheld that those states that don't respect equality will not be able to get funding for projects in the same way as states that do. And so this is kind of a backdoor way of trying to enforce compliance in those states that are showing these illiberal tendencies. One of the problems, though, is that a lot of member states don't actually want to be too strict about it because they're worried that they might be the next states to have this rise in radical right. So, I mean, you see in France, Marine Le Pen has been very successful. In Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, has been quite successful. Italy has just elected a right-wing government. So it's really hard to expect those states where there is fairly high public support for these restrictions to also be imposing the restrictions on other states. So the EU is trying through sort of these mechanisms that they have, but as long as there is such a number of states that are slightly going in that direction, I think the effects will be minimal, unfortunately.
Yeah. I have another question from a student, which is kind of interesting, curious your thoughts here. She writes, how has the United States overturning of Roe v. Wade and abortion rights on a national level affected women's equality in either in EU healthcare or in Canada? Either way or both?
I think as a Canadian, I'll say that around things like healthcare, we tend to look at the US, and anytime something like that happens, we go, oh, thank God we're not in the US. And if anything, it actually entrenches our desire to be different and to maintain those rights. So although there are one or two cases in Alberta, one of the provinces further to the west, which is a little bit more restrictive than the rest of the country, for the most part in Canada, and I think in the EU as well, this overturning of Roe v. Wade has made a lot of governments, countries, activists say, we can't go that route. So actually to look at the US as a negative example. That said, there are states in the EU that also have extremely restrictive abortion policies. The EU was very effective, very slowly, but very effective in opening up abortion rights in Ireland. And this happened very gradually over the course of, well, actively working for it well over 40 years, where Ireland actually at one point had a limit on, you had the right to free travel, you had the right to free movement of goods and services, as long as those things did not restrict Ireland's ability to restrict abortion. So they actually had this clause built in earlier treaties that slowly has been disappearing as they've opened up. But things like free movement and access to healthcare across the member states mean that worst case scenario, women are able to cross borders and access services, which on the one hand means that the states can stay restrictive because we find workarounds, because we're women and we need to find workarounds because we've had to find workarounds for the past millennia. But at the same time, it means that because we're finding workarounds, the pressure isn't necessarily on for change. So I'm not sure that it's Roe v. Wade that necessarily makes the changes in the EU, but I think that sometimes it makes states like Canada or other Western states that are kind of teetering sometimes look at that and say, ooh, that's not what we want to do. We need to re-entrench rights and security and things like that.
So, we were talking before we started here, and so we have a question. I'm going to try to frame this, but because you ended by thinking about intersectionality and the ways in which bringing an intersectional lens would actually, really support the process in expanding legislation, anti-discriminatory legislation and parity, et cetera. So, but our question is sort of like, how, and a student asked this too, is how might this happen? How might, intersectional lens be operationalized, if you will? And in doing that, would it necessarily sort of bump this neoliberal or economic piece that has been so central in understanding discriminatory practices? How do we dislodge that from the center, and two, and bring an intersectional lens to being able to affect change here.
Right.
We just want you to solve this problem for us
for the
today.
entire world, please.
How much time do I have?
But I just wanted to add to that a little bit, because where you ended was speaking about the fact that you feel there is a movement in terms of breaking down binaries, and or the EU is working on that. And if there's any way you can give us, a concrete example or two where you see that kind of movement, breakdown of binaries, that would be so helpful and hopeful at the same time.
Okay, so I think the first step in terms of, let me try to take these questions sort of one at a time, because there's lots there. I think the first step of what the EU needs to actually do is to start collecting data. And I think the biggest problem in some ways, and maybe this is just me with my academic hat on, but you need the evidence that there is actually intersectional discrimination. Realistically, we all know it's there. We all know that it's happening. But the states, due to some unfortunate historic trends and tendencies, do not collect data around religion, race, or ethnicity as a general rule. And it's not just France, although France is the one that we always hear about. Most of the states will not collect data around those statistics. Now, the EU has an institute, the European Institute for Gender Equality, and they have an anti-racism institute, the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Association, I think.
Fundamental Rights Agency.
I figured it wasn't an association. And they will collect some of that data, but they can't do it in a formal way. So often because they're not permitted to. So I think the first thing that they have to do, if you want to make an intersectional argument and want to take intersectional steps, is you need to see where are minority women in the workforce. How many minority women are facing discrimination in various different ways versus white women versus minority men versus, right? We have to start to see those connections. And that's going to take a while. Once we see the connections, or we even can just accept that they are there, then I think we can start making policy which will recognize that things cannot be shoehorned into a single box. And I mean, the example, I didn't have time, I didn't want to extend on it enough, but one of the key examples has really been around traditional Islamic dress in the European Union. And I think this has been, it's been a big conversation in a number of states, in some ways far bigger than it needs to be. So in the Netherlands, they've actually banned burqas and niqab. And I think some of the statistics show that this huge conversation that's been had around this actually affects on the ground something like less than 50 people. Now, I'm not saying that those 50 people should have their rights restricted, but it's sort of this question of how are we prioritizing these conversations, and how are these conversations being had? And they're presented sometimes as being a huge problem. But if we're recognizing these sorts of issues as a problem population, then that's our problem. Because minorities cannot be viewed as problems. They are citizens of the country. The problem is that the institutions are not recognizing them as citizens. So that's where I say that the difficulty is about changing the ways in which we're thinking about things. So we don't have to solve the problem of Muslim workers in the European Union. We have to solve the problem of people thinking that somebody standing with a hijab at the counter is going to somehow mean that people aren't going to purchase things at their store. Like, that's kind of the problem. So it's about how things are being framed. There were two cases that went to the Court of Justice of the European Union this summer, which were interestingly both from Germany and both about customer service representatives wearing a hijab. And the court ruled differently in the two different cases based on where the women were in the employment. If you were a front service worker and for some reason it was seen as being detrimental to the corporation, you were a frontline worker, then you could be asked to remove your head covering. But if you work in the back in the warehouse and you're hidden, then that was okay, and you couldn't ask the person to take off their hijab. So there's still this real sense, even as they're starting to look at these instances which don't fit clearly into being women's rights or religious rights, but really these intersectional, multidisciplinary, multi-forms of discrimination, they are slowly looking at them, but they're still doing it in a way that presents the individual who is being discriminated against as the problem. And that's what I think needs to change. How do we do that? Haven't got a clue. I mean, the key is social change. And that is very, very slow, but it is happening. So some of the research that I do has been around some of the newcomers to Germany in the migrant crisis 2015 and 16, and what various organizations on the ground did for gendered awareness. So what sorts of policies or what sorts of programs were put in place specifically for women or specifically for young men. And on the ground, there is so much intersectional stuff going on. So there was a recognition that one of the barriers that newcomers faced is transportation and finances. Makes sense. We know that. You only get around by bus because you don't have a car, and the bus schedules are often kind of sketchy and they cost a lot. So the solution was to teach women to ride bicycles. And so I think that's actually a really intersectional approach, because it recognizes that cultural norms in home countries prevented them from having access to that type of education when they were little girls. And now that would offer freedom and access to communities which they didn't otherwise have. So sometimes I think the intersectional solution is actually about taking the blinders off and just looking at the problem. The problem is I don't have a way to get around and it costs too much to go by bus. Let's solve the problem. Access to bicycles and training. And to be aware then that you can't have the men doing it, but sometimes for cultural norms, we need female teachers. And so again, by just making sure that the people who were working with the women learning to ride the bicycle were women, you again were recognizing some of these barriers. So I think it's about removing the barriers step by step by step and changing the way we're thinking. Sounds easy, doesn't it?
Like riding a bike.
Yeah, no problem.
I have a question that's sort of going back to this economic central, because I'm just thinking about unpaid labor.
Yep.
Or, invisible labor, reproductive labor, caring for family, caring for children, caring for elders, all the work that, overwhelmingly is done by women. And how, is there any way in which the EU is trying to address unpaid labor, given that the frame is so much about paid labor?
I mean, they address it again, they can't, because it's in the household. And so they have no jurisdiction. That is as pure as social policy and welfare policy can be. And the EU has no redistributive powers. So where we in a state often think about welfare, we think about the state paying you, housing allowance, unemployment insurance, something along that line. And they get that through the tax base. But the EU doesn't have that. So the EU has no ability in its welfare or social policies to actually give anybody money. So all it can do is try to change structures or change access. And this is where we get into the catch-22. There's a wonderful policy paper about recovery from COVID. And what she does is show how 2% increase in funding from the state to care sector would have a huge impact on the overall economic growth. Whereas a 2% increase in the manufacturing sector has almost no change in economic growth. So she makes this very great argument about the importance of the care sector and investing in the care sector. But in order to do it, she has to ground it in the economic principles of overarching state growth. And so any argument we want to make about why something is good for women or why something is good for minorities isn't about the good for its own sake. It's because it leads to economic growth.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, that was true here, right? That the aid that went to children and families during COVID was a tremendous boon to the economy. Not that anyone wants to talk about that now, but that there was data on that it went into this, real surge of spending, so Carolyn, I'm wondering if you have any questions, students, if you have questions that you want to put in the chat. I have pretty much kind of shared the ones that had come to me.
Sure. I also like to leave the floor to students first before I jump in. So I'll see if there's any hands up. So I like, there were a few things that kind of came out of the discussion. Talking about the rise of illiberalism in Europe, looking at Poland and Hungary. And so just for those of you in the Zoom room right now, I'm doing research on the EU's anti-Semitism policy, which is another social policy. Again, some of the issues that Professor MacRae is framing are the same challenges that anti-Semitism has had. But what's interesting, watching the unfolding of anti-Semitism policy, which has nothing to do with the free market at all, or competition policy, like nothing, which makes it kind of interesting. What the big push right now on the part of the Commission and the Fundamental Rights Agency is data. And the Commission, I'm on like their email list for the combating anti-Semitism portion of the Commission. And they just sent out a call. We have money to give to, basically it's going to be for non-governmental organizations, because we know governments aren't going to do this, to get the measurements. And I think that's what has catapulted anti-Semitism to the fore, because the Fundamental Rights Agency was putting out studies, again, that they were hiring non-governmental organizations to produce them, because states don't produce them. And now the Commission is really pushing member states to give us data on anti-Semitism in your countries, and we should have it the same across the board. And they're putting money behind this. So, with thinking about the intersectionality issue or gender issue, is there any push to say, here's a way to get data, or is there a push to do that?
Yeah, and this is where like the EU is kind of interesting, is that because we always just talk about the EU, right? And not only are you 27 member states, but there's all these different institutions and agencies within the EU. So the Parliament, in particular, the European Parliament, has got a really powerful women's committee called the FEM Committee. And they love to do studies. And so they'll do all kinds of studies at the EU level. And then there's the European Institute for Gender Equality, same thing. They are constantly producing these studies, and the European Women's Lobby. But and this goes back to the earlier question about the intersectionality, a lot of these organizations have carved out their niche within that huge European set of structures. And it's actually somewhat threatening for them in a way to move to an intersectional approach. Because if everybody is being intersectional, do we need to do the data on women in poverty by the European Women's Lobby, or should the poverty organizations be looking at what percentage of women are in poverty? And if we pass it over to the ones who are thematically looking at poverty to say, generate this data in a gender neutral, racial, blah, 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 et cetera, kind of a way, then what good, in quotation marks, is the European Women's Lobby anymore? So you often see that within the organizations themselves, they don't want to be intersectional. They want the intersectional data, but they don't actually want intersectionality, because that starts to challenge the importance of their and the primacy of their form of discrimination. So I think that this is particularly the case. I'll maybe throw some of my feminist friends under the bus here, for a lot of the women's organizations who could claim to have 50% of the population, whereas most of the other organizations, take a smaller slice of the pie, so to speak. And so this is one of these challenges of intersectionality, is that as we start to generate that data on an intersectional level, it may actually undermine the importance of gender mainstreaming or racial mainstreaming. And there's a real pushback against that from within those organizations. So, I mean, the things around anti-Semitism, you're right, because they're not economic. I don't know how the EU is really able to carve out its space in that way, because they don't have that foothold that so many other organizations have. Poverty, you can talk about class as being clearly an economic issue. You can talk about visible minorities, if we use that term, from an economic perspective, because they're kept out of the labor market. But typically the Jewish population, at least in recent years, is very, very well integrated into the European.
And in the interviews that I do in the commission, they're like, yeah, the job equality stuff doesn't really apply at all. Like, there's no discrimination about a Jew working in a, whatever, in whatever capacity. And I would actually argue from the side of anti-Semitism, it has to do particularly with the commission's role in trying to push forward the ideals of liberal democracy and values, which is not something part of the free market. It's this value-oriented goal. And I think that, you mentioned the push to try to get Poland and Hungary in particular. There's a couple other ones that are, other ones, but, to focus on this idea of rule of law and liberalism, which includes inclusion of minorities, right? And proper treatment of minorities. That's my cat. I'm sorry. She's very old. It's not a child screaming in the back. So, in thinking about rule of law and how the EU is using money to, hold back from certain countries, where do you see that going as sort of the values of the, and even thinking about the EU's role in the fight in Ukraine, what are the values and ideals of the EU? And is that driving also some of the policy initiatives? I don't know if that's true for gender at all.
Like 15 years ago, I probably would have said that I think values are actually a really good way to get ahead in the EU, like to push for particular policies or policy changes. And that was back when the EU was talking a lot about questions of identity, and they were trying to create a notion of what it was to be a European citizen. And we implemented the European passports and the currency and all these sorts of things. And identity was sort of at the forefront, and values are connected directly into that question of identity. And it worked because at that time we had mostly social democratic or centrist governments. And so they overpowered the right-wing governments, which have always been there. And there's always been sectors in each of these governments that have been more right-wing. The difference now, post 2014-ish, is the degree to which these voices are being heard in the governments right across the states. And so that's bringing something very different to the European institutions and their tables. You're not going to get the council to agree to a lot of things that they used to agree to, because now the people sitting around the table are the Orbáns and the Kaczynskis and the others, and the Le Pens to a lesser degree, but some of them supporting at the table. And so now I think this values question is becoming problematic because it's now pitched against sovereignty. The EU cannot impose values on a member state. And there's a reluctance to let that happen. And I think if it happens, it's going to have some sort of a constitutional underpinning to it. Like, all the member states are going to have to sign back on to this concept of the rule of law. And that's not likely in the near future. So one of the things that they did, I'm sure you've seen this, Carolyn, is they had these reports where they looked at the role of the rule of law in every one of the member states. So Poland and Hungary were complaining that they were being singled out, which was probably true. And so they looked at all of the states across all of the same markers to try to see really what they were hoping to do was to say, look, Poland and Hungary, you guys are the bad guys. But in fact, what they found was that there was an awful lot of breaches of the rule of law across all of the member states. So Croatia comes out pretty badly. Austria comes out very poorly. Belgium to some extent. I mean, there are all sorts of states right across the continent have pretty big problems with treatment of minorities, with the role of minorities in various different organizations. And that's going to make it hard to buy into the values statement, because when states are looking at their own values, they're recognizing that it's not actually happening. Does that make sense?
It does,
Yeah.
yes. Go ahead,
I think we have to leave it there as our students and the professors have a class.
I understand. I'm sorry.
No, it's so interesting and provocative, and our work is cut out for us really everywhere. But thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your work. We really appreciate it. And students, we'll see you on Thursday. And
Back in the classroom.
back in the classroom, yeah. And we'll have, I'm posting a reading for Thursday on the commission, the EU Commission on Gender, so we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carolyn, for helping organize, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Professor MacRae, for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good class. Bye.
Bye.